is our Dharma? What is our quest? How's it going, everyone? This is Matt from Dharma Nights. So I recorded a walkthrough and review of a cheat sheet that I put together for my current 300 level Yoga Teacher Trainee students. There's a final exam at the end of their 300 level Yoga Teacher Training program, and I usually put together a roundup of the most important takeaways that I want them to have by the end of the course. So this ended up being something like an hour and 20 minutes long, way longer than I expected. So I'm cutting this up into a few different slices. And for those of you who are not in a yoga teacher training program, maybe you still enjoy this kind of stuff. Hopefully, either way, it has value for you. But certainly for my students, you guys should definitely have a bite-sized resource now that should help you feel a little bit more confident about some of the stuff that I included in that sheet. Namaste. What can you tell me about Arjuna and Krishna's social ranks comparatively? So this is something I mentioned in passing earlier. Arjuna is royalty. Krishna is not. They're both capable warriors. So elsewhere in the story, Krishna demonstrates his battlefield prowess. He's a very powerful, respected warrior. But in this case, he's like always a kingmaker, never a king, right? So they're both capable warriors, but Krishna was raised in obscurity among rural cowherds. One little bit of irony, Krishna and the unacknowledged eldest Pandava that I mentioned earlier, Karna, they both have a similar situation where they, for very different reasons, where they're born to royalty, or at least nobility, but they end up being raised in obscurity. But they have very different life paths. So Krishna generally chooses whatever's aligned with Dharma versus what he personally wants or what pleases him. And Karna more or less chooses his friendship over duty, chooses his own honor and his own ambitions over Dharma. And that's one of the reasons why they're such a stark contrast to one another. Okay, so again, Arjuna is royalty, Krishna is not. So Arjuna is a prince, Krishna is not. In fact, Krishna is voluntarily serving as his charioteer, which is a lower social rank. They're both capable warriors, but Krishna was raised in obscurity among rural cowherds. So he's like a cowboy, right? He's a very alluring and seductive cowboy, but he's a cowboy. And so is the rest of his clan, the Yadavas. They're basically a bunch of cowboys, which is also why they're good at fighting. Krishna voluntarily serves as Arjuna's charioteer, which is a decidedly lower social rank than a prince. Though Krishna is actually the supreme god of the universe in human form, he deliberately lowers himself to serve his friend Arjuna and to serve the rest of the world, because Vishnu usually preserves the world. He recognizes the higher transcendent reality, so he doesn't get lost in the world, but he does voluntarily have experiences of the world and recognizes the value of Maya. It's not just illusions to be discarded, right? There's something valuable about it. He deliberately and voluntarily lowers himself to serve his friend Arjuna and the world. What does the Bhagavad Gita, through Krishna's discourse, say about renunciation versus action? One does not have to renounce the world, for example, like a monk would renounce the world, or drop out of society, like a monk would drop out, to have a spiritual experience. So you don't have to renounce the world to have a spiritual experience. You don't have to renounce the world to have union with the divine. Okay? So one can choose action rather than inaction so long as the motivations for action are focused correctly, so long as the intention is good. And in this case, what does that mean for the intention to be good? When acting, one should do so without attachment or desire for the fruits of that action. Meaning you're not attached to the results. Your ego is not invested in the results. You're not doing it for what's personally rewarding or satisfying. You're doing it for Dharma, and you're not personally attached or emotionally attached to the outcome. So that's how you can act with a sort of renunciation without renouncing the actual world. That's how you can do your duty without renouncing the world. So one can replace ego motivations with intentions aligned with Dharma. So if you have ego motivations in what you're about to do, get rid of those ego motivations and replace them with motivations and intentions that are aligned with Dharma. And again, just to review, Dharma is usually but not always aligned with custom and law, and it's about concerning oneself with the hungers and fears of others, right? So that's why duty is usually associated with Dharma. It's not, so Arjuna's cousins, the Kauravas, are not principally motivated by duty. They're principally motivated by ego, desire, and power. So Krishna says, you don't have to renounce all action. You can just do your duty for Dharma without being attached. So if one has difficulty formulating the demands of Dharma, like if they're confused about what Dharma demands, then one can simply choose devotion to Krishna instead. So if you're making your best guess as to what's demanded by Dharma, but you're at least, or arguably at most, doing it in devotion to Krishna. And it's not Krishna like, hey, I'm God and I'm personally pleased by this, but the things that are devoted to Krishna and that are good for Krishna are usually what's good for the world. So Krishna wants what's best for the world because he's the preserver God. So it's not about what personally pleases him. And that can confuse a lot of people when they read the Bhagavad Gita because, Krishna is saying me and I a lot, but he's also spending as much time saying, he's spending as much time saying things like, do it in devotion to me, as he's spending time actually defining what things please him, and usually what things are things that would make him feel good about what the devotee is doing, right? And those definitions are usually things that are aligned with Dharma and what's good for the world. So what spiritual movement was happening in India about which the Gita was directly providing an alternative spiritual worldview and an alternative strategy for spiritual life, wherein one could still perform one's duties within society. So maybe a simpler way of saying that is, what was happening in India around the time of this story of the Bhagavad Gita and the Mahabharata? What spiritual movement was happening at that time? What spiritual movement was happening at that time where people were dropping out of society rather than doing their duties in society? And the answer would be Buddhist monasticism, in other words, people becoming Buddhist monks. Buddhist monasticism was increasing in popularity, and to a lesser extent, Jainism was also kind of expanding, but Jainism never grew quite as aggressively as Buddhism grew, although it did have some significant devotees in numbers, not anywhere near what it has today, but these were both movements where people were leaving the mainstream fold of society or leaving the Vedic way of life to become monks in these orders. And doing so would very often result in them, abandoning whatever caste they were born into. Not that people were saying the word caste back then, but that, if you were a prince and you became a monk, you were no longer a prince, to put it in the most simple terms. If you were a householder and you became a monk, you were no longer a householder. And, if you were the lowest societal ranked servant or laborer and you left that to become a monk, then you were just a monk. You weren't that low class laborer anymore. You were a monk. So when this happened, this left vacancies in societal roles. Householders were abandoning their jobs and families. So all of a sudden, you go to the guy to do a job that needs doing. Where did he go? Oh, he left. He became a monk. Oh, well, I guess no one can do this job now, right? Or the wife and children are where did daddy go? Why isn't daddy bringing home food? And they're oh, daddy went and became a monk. So now we're on our own, right? So that's what was happening at the time when the Gita was being expanded as a written work in and of itself. and where Krishna is basically giving this alternative way to have a spiritual experience, and it's an alternative to people dropping out and becoming monks. What are the three main paths of yoga that Krishna explains to Arjuna in the Gita? And bonus question, what is arguably the fourth main path of yoga? And I ask the student to list and define them. So karma yoga, or the yoga of action, is performing actions aligned with Dharma or even bhakti, which is devotion, stripped of ego motivation. But the short version is it's the yoga of action. But it's like, again, we talked about the motivations for action earlier, and it's like karma yoga is doing an action aligned with Dharma that's stripped of your own ego motivations. So very often an act of karma yoga will be something that is like providing service, like unselfish service, or at least doing something unselfishly. And that can become a whole way of life. So then you have jnana yoga, or the yoga of intellect, which is diligent study, acquisition of knowledge, and especially of spiritual matters, but not exclusively. So someone could spend their whole lives studying and teaching sacred scripture, or even scriptures of knowledge, and that would be a path of jnana yoga, like the yoga of intellect. Bhakti yoga, or the yoga of devotion and affection, this is a path where yogi does not get rid of their emotion, but rather yokes that emotion to an ecstatic celebration of the divine and the transcendent forms of love and devotion. So, some of these other paths, they seem to say strip yourself of emotion, but this elaboration of bhakti yoga basically makes it clear that that's not even necessarily what's required. It's just making sure you're yoking your emotions to the right force, right? So that's why when you see these big bhakti festivals where people are ecstatically playing music and they're chanting the names of Krishna and Ram and so on and so forth, they are very emotional. They're, crying, and they're all exultant, and they're dancing, and it's a burst of celebration. But it's using all that emotion towards a transcendent principle or deity, right? So Krishna says that all these paths are valid, but bhakti is dearest to him. So out of all those three that I just mentioned, he says they're all equally valid, but devotion and affection to him and to higher principles is the one that's dearest to him. So the bonus one, what's the bonus fourth? Raja Yoga, or the Yoga of Kings, is like a systematic meditative practice, which we later see examples further articulated, for example, in the Yoga Sutras or other foundational yoga texts and movements, where they're saying, hey, here's an actual system of practice. And it's usually focused around meditation. And so, the 8 limbs of yoga, it's a system. It's a discipline practice, and it has goal might be the wrong word, but it has a design. So those other three are very open-ended, right? So you can articulate that and apply that in some fairly specific ways, but it's very open. The Gita doesn't define very specific ways of life within those containers, but Raja Yoga is the practice of systematically defined and articulated practices. So what are the 3 gunas? The gunas, which is a Sanskrit word for strands or qualities, are energetic forces that weave together to form the universe and everything in it. So qualities. There are 3 gunas, each of which has its unique attributes. So there's tamas, which often gets translated as inertia or even dark inertia. Rajas, which is activity or passion. And sattva, which is equanimity, tranquility, and evenness. And just as an aside, people will usually say, oh, well, sattva guna must be the only desirable one for a yogi, we should be perfectly sattvic. But in reality, good yogic practice includes but by the reckoning of many, including myself, will include elements of tamas and rajas and sattva. Even if like sattva is what you're using the other two to get you towards, it's still like in some ways combines good aspects of tamas, like slowing things down, good aspects of rajas, like for example, like raising the tempo in a physical practice, like to give it some discipline, and sattva guna, which can kind of even everything out towards tranquility. So I have a true or false question. When Arjuna asks and is granted to see Krishna's universal form, he bursts into flame. Just like the Greek myths, when Zeus's human lovers ask to see his divine form. So this is false. Arjuna does not burst into flame or become disintegrated when Krishna shows him his universal form. Instead, Arjuna sees this large universal Vishnu form where he's consuming the souls and bodies of everyone on the battlefield and really also entire worlds. But then he's like recycling that material, so to speak, back into the universe. So he's not just like consuming and disintegrating and transmuting things into nothingness. He's like keeping the energies and the material of the world in constant flow. And this is also kind of compared to the largest scale yajna or ritual fire offering imaginable, wherein all the warriors of the battlefield and also all the worlds everywhere are offered to him to honor and consume. So just as an aside, a lot of the Bhagavad Gita talks about these Vedic fire rituals and says like, yeah, they're okay, but that's not the best thing per se. Like, people are doing these rituals for personal gain and to like get favor and some sort of exchange out of the devas. But really, you should do a very different kind of offering, and that's like offer up your ego intentions as a sacrifice or an exchange to me, in exchange for like, the yoga of all these dharmic influence paths like karma yoga and all this stuff. Like, do all that in offering to me, and that's way better than a literal fire sacrifice to the devas. So when Arjuna sees this universal form, he's awed, also afraid, but he's basically intact from the experience, and eventually asks, like, okay, I'm overwhelmed. Can you take your human form again? So Arjuna is also embarrassed that for so many years he was behaving with Krishna like he was just any other person, any other friend. Like he would share jokes, play, share fun experiences, and all along he's been doing this with the supreme God of the universe. But Krishna deflects that and says, I'm still your friend. I'm also this other thing, but yes, I'm still your friend and I love you. So in the Mahabharata, how do the Pandavas ultimately have to win the Great War? Krishna advises them at several crucial moments to cheat and to fight dishonorably, as it's the only way to win against these very powerful set of enemies, their cousins, who have like all these very powerful people fighting for them, like arguably invincible people fighting for them. So Krishna says, cheat and fight dishonorably at these crucial moments, because that's the greater way to restore Dharma to the world, which is presently dragged down into a state of corruption. And of course, this has a bit of that karma symmetry, because he's telling them to cheat and fight dishonorably, which mirrors the time that they were cheated and treated dishonorably by their cousins in the rigged gambling match. So what is the Hatha Yoga Pradipika? That is a 15th century text of instructions for the practice of Hatha Yoga, primarily for monks. And the Hatha Yoga, as defined by the text itself, is like kind of bodily preparation for yogic practice. So stuff that focuses on the body. So why is the Pradipika important for the physical aspects of yoga? It is one of the oldest texts we have which provides explicitly bodily oriented instructions for several asana, most or even all of which are sitting, by the way, just as an aside, as well as mudras. And that's not mudras just like hand gestures, which students always think that's what is meant by mudras. But when you read the Pradipika, they're doing full body mudras with different positionings, kind of like an asana, but they're also engaging their bandhas. And and the Pradipika also contains other body cleansing practices. And I did not include this in the bullet point, but it also it kind of like sketches the picture of what a Hatha yoga practitioner is going to look like what kind of hut they're going to live in, how they're going to live in isolation from, constant activity and all this stuff. They got to live in a good country that's peaceful and prosperous. And here's how the yogi is going to succeed. Here's a bunch of elements, and then here's how the yogi is going to fail. Here's a bunch of potential danger points. So the second bullet point I have for this question, why the Pradipika is important for physical aspects of yoga, I say it is referenced by a great number of texts persistently after its appearance in the 15th century. So there's a bunch of texts that all mention the Pradipika or cite it or reference it from the 15th century onward when it was written. Who does the author of the Pradipika place at the very beginning of the lineage of its not yogi practitioners? So they say, here's who's at the beginning of our lineage. And who is it? None other than Shiva himself, who then taught some human disciples like Matsyendranath, Gorakhnath, but it started with Shiva. They put him at the very base of their lineage. Who is the Trimurti in Hindu mythology and religion? Name and define all three. So we have Brahma, who's the creator god who gets lost in Maya, in his own creation. So he makes this massive burst of creation and then gets lost in it, right? Sort of like he creates the matrix and gets lost and enamored with his own matrix creation. Then we have Vishnu, the preserver god, who sees value in this creation of Maya, like subjective material existence. He sees value in it, but he also values the transcendent reality beyond it. Then you have Shiva, the destroyer, or kind of like the deconstructor god. And Shiva is the ultimate yogi, the god who has grown beyond all hungers and fears, like all hungers and needs. He disintegrates illusions. He disintegrates societal conventions, material limitations. He's done with those. Nothing materially limits him. And he represents the uncreated infinite beyond the mortal world. So, in a nutshell, that's the Trimurti. Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva. Brahma the creator, Vishnu the preserver, Shiva the destroyer. And destroyer is not morally loaded, like he's not like Satan. He's not like the enemy of humanity. Shiva destroys illusion. He destroys limitation in Maya, basically. Who is the Tridevi in Hindu mythology and religion? Name and define all three. So we have Saraswati, the goddess of knowledge, language, music, and art. We have Lakshmi, who's the goddess of material prosperity and abundance, who circulates wealth in the world, making sure everyone's bowl is full, so to speak. And this is exactly unlike the image of a hoarding European dragon who just has a bunch of gold but sits on it, doesn't circulate. Lakshmi and the wealth that she embodies and the energy of prosperity is basically like dependent on it all circulating and moving. So then you have Parvati, the householder goddess, who's also the great mother. Next question is, who is the dark, wild, destructive aspect of the goddess in her three forms? And this would be Kali, who drinks blood and dances on her husband Shiva's corpse. Often when the goddess, especially in her Lakshmi form, is disrespected or exploited beyond a certain point, Kali emerges, whose rage is only satisfied by blood or by Shiva's erect penis while he lies like a corpse beneath her. And some of the more sanitized versions of that story is just that he lies down and sleeps underneath her, and then she stops dancing on him because she's embarrassed. But the less PG-rated versions are no, Shiva slides underneath her with an erect penis, and that's the only thing that gets her to calm down. So map the three gods in the Trimurti to their three consorts in the Tridevi. And that would be Brahma has the consort of Saraswati, Vishnu has the consort of Lakshmi, and Shiva has the goddess consort of Parvati. So each of these gods has a consort. And just as an aside, that's largely informed by the idea that gods are like principles or embodiments of energy, and goddesses are like principles and embodiments of matter, just to put it roughly. So like Brahma, like the creator, like Brahma creates, and Saraswati is the goddess of materials of creation, right? Like art, language, music, etc. Vishnu is the preserver. He preserves. And what does he preserve? Lakshmi is the goddess of the world and material prosperity and all that stuff. So Vishnu preserves the place where there is prosperity. Shiva is the destroyer or the deconstructor. And what does Shiva destroy and deconstruct? Oddly enough, he deconstructs the restraints of the household, which is Parvati's domain. She's like the goddess of the household. She's the one that sort of, I don't want to say tricks Shiva into being a householder or having like some concern for the world, but it's sort of like along that lines. Who are the Devas? They're a pantheon of immortal deities presiding over certain elemental forces. And an example, Indra, their king, is the lightning god, and he's often compared to Zeus. It's kind of an imperfect comparison, but they at least have in common that they chuck lightning bolts at their enemies, and it's very fearsome, right? They guard their heavenly paradise, Svarg, from the Asuras. Though they are powerful and divine, they are flawed, kind of like the Olympians are flawed. So they're like a definitive step below the Trimurti we mentioned earlier of Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva. They're at a lower order of being, even though they are divine. So they are strengthened and nourished by yagnas, or fire offerings, by mortals. So, in the Vedic times, they would make these fire rituals, and this is still done. Certainly there'd be fire offerings, the Vedic chant, buttered ghee and other offerings would be put into the fire. And this was thought to then, through the fire, or Agni, god of fire, this was thought to then be like made available as nourishment to the rest of the devas. So in some sense, this like nourished or strengthened them, even though they're immortal anyway. So because the devas are immortal, and that's a whole different story, why they're immortal, about the Amrita, the nectar of immortality, right? Because they're immortal, they're the cosmic 1%ers, right? They don't actually do anything to produce wealth or value. They just defend it. They're like warrior kings, basically, except in godly terms. But since they're the cosmic 1%ers, they begin with vigilance over their wealth and their station, but grow increasingly complacent until their adversaries, the Asuras, periodically defeat them. So they hang around being like 1%ers, enjoying their wealth, but not actually creating value, not actually creating prosperity, none of that, right? They just sort of have it and defend it. And their adversaries, the subterranean Asuras, are jealous about it and ambitious, and they periodically dethrone them. So that brings us to the next and final one. Who are the Asuras? They're ambitious subterranean divine beings who are the Devas' eternal enemies. And just as a side note, there's terrible translation issues where people usually describe Devas as gods and Asuras as demons. That's missing the mark. There are other bad translations where they call Devas gods and Asuras titans. That also misses the mark. Because, the Olympians and the Titans were not locked in an eternal struggle. Like, the Titans were definitively defeated and then jailed, more or less, right? But the Devas and the Asuras are locked in this eternal struggle. And it's not that one is essentially good and one is essentially evil. It's just that, like, they're both flawed. But they're locked in this conflict for all eternity, which helps actually provide some of the, like, nourishing energy to the rest of the universe. But as a like output of that conflict, right? So, again, Asuras are ambitious, subterranean divine beings who are the Devas' eternal enemies. They actually produce wealth. They produce value. They're ambitious. Though they are not immortal like the Devas, they do have a guru who regenerates them after death. So they would get killed in battle, and their guru sort of regenerates or even arguably reincarnates them on the spot. So their struggle with the Devas drags on eternally in cycles of victory and defeat, where they occasionally dethrone the devas and exile them until the devas win back their paradise, and they usually win back their paradise specifically with help from Vishnu. Sometimes through help from Brahma or Shiva, but very often from Vishnu. Vishnu ends up being called in as a big gun against the Asuras all the time when they get too big for their britches. So these Asuras ambitiously perform tapasya, which we could call yogic disciplines. They certainly look a lot like yogic disciplines, but just to differentiate that a little, for it to be a yogic discipline, their true goal would have to be union, right? Like the opposite of alienation. It would have to have like sort of unselfish motivations. But in this case, it's tapasya, meaning like cleansing disciplines instead. And because they perform this tapasya, and I like to joke, because they go do so much yoga and they get so good at yoga, right? Even though their intentions are not really yogic, because they do all this stuff, they gain many powers, right? They do the work, they get the powers. These asuras do the work, and the asuras get the powers. So Brahma and Shiva say, oh, you did all this discipline, you get the reward, here's a boon. And very often the boon will be some kind of like invincibility with some hidden flaw in it, right? Because when the asuras were asking for the particular boon, they didn't word it carefully enough, right? So there's always like some vulnerability written into it. And they occasionally get so powerful that Vishnu, who again is above the devas, must intervene to defeat them. So that is the quote-unquote cheat sheet that I put together for my current students of YTT 300 level. And each of these concepts that I covered for different reasons, and I could almost do whole podcast episodes as to why I picked the things that I did. But, the short version is that a lot of these concepts are best illustrated in some of the stories. You can lecture to someone about a concept all day long and bore them to tears or sleep. But when you tell them a story that embodies this idea, they come alive in a very different way. And that's, in my opinion, also why when you look at the history of these concepts and materials, they started with Vedas, which is like things that people did, right? Hymns or rituals, more or less. You had Upanishads, which was people lecturing about the content of those Vedas in one way or another. And let's be real, not everyone shows up for a lecture. But then when you had stories that embodied these ideas, like the epics and then later the Puranic stories, suddenly people can understand them a lot more, right? And they understand them in a deep way that kind of lives inside them. So that's kind of high level why I chose the things that I did. And hopefully this also has value to any of you who are not yoga students, or at least not taking a yoga exam. And if you were taking a yoga philosophy exam, I'm sure it would look very different from mine. But again, I've shared some of the reason why I kind of frame it this way, and maybe that resonates with you, maybe it doesn't. But in either case, I hope you enjoyed and got something out of it.